I know it's not an opinion shared by many, but seeing old games get a new lease of life by being made available on modern systems always brings a smile to my face. Even those which many don't consider to be worth saving. So, when the July set of games was announced for the Switch Online service, I couldn't help but do a double take, because one of those which was announced was the Super NES port of Bomb Uzal. Of course, there was plenty of skepticism around its inclusion, as tends to be the case with many of the more unique choices they add, but for me, it got me intrigued. So intrigued in fact that I decided to dust off my C64 copy of the game and finally sit down to give it a serious play. And so, here we are. Bomb Uzal was originally released in 1988 for the Commodore 64, designed and developed by the duo of Tony Crowther and David Bishop, and originally published by Mirasoft. Along with this C64 original, ports to the Amiga and Atari ST were released around the same time alongside, with a DOS port appearing the following year. The Super NES port which inspired this video was developed and published by Kemco, originally released in Japan in 1990, and appearing in North America in 1992. Unsurprisingly, said Super NES version did not get a PAL release. From the outset, there isn't much of a story here. You take charge of this blobby creature and need to work your way through a stack of levels. And I really mean a stack of them, with 129 in the C64 version and almost double in the other computer versions. The goal for each stage is to detonate all the explosives present before time runs out. It's a straightforward enough goal, at least in the opening stages. But as you get further and further into the game, the challenge can ramp up pretty darn quickly. The explosives you're tasked with detonating are grouped into bombs and mines. Bombs are detonated by standing over them, then holding the fire button for a few seconds before you'll need to step aside. As for the mines, the act of walking over those is enough to set one off. Unsurprisingly, that means you're going to lose one of your lives should you do so. Instead, taking them out relies on setting off chain reactions. Bombs and mines come in 3 sizes, with each successive size offering an increased blast radius once detonated. This of course results in more of the map being destroyed, but also, and more importantly, can also set off explosives further away as well, which is genuinely exciting once an entire chain reaction sets off just about everything in a level. There are 2 more bomb types as well. Swell bombs continually expand and contract, and once detonated, will explode based on their present size. Aerial bombs are all linked together, so if one were to explode, then all the others in the level will go off as well, even if they're outside of the blast radius of the first. If the levels just offered bombs and mines, things would probably become quite repetitive. So, there's plenty of tricks and traps you'll have to work with in order to make your detonations stick and complete the levels. First up, there's dissolver tiles, which crumble away as you walk over. On many levels, planning your route over them is paramount to avoid being trapped in an unrecoverable position. Ice tiles are devilish, as when you step on one, you'll slide across the map until you reach a non-ice tile, or fall off the edge of the level to your doom. Slot tiles are ones which are linked up to form tracks across part of a level. Any bob situated on one can be picked up and moved to any free space which can be reached without walking over another bomb. Levels which feature these tend to use them in order to have you set up a precise chain reaction. At first glance, the temples might not seem that special. Being situated next to a bomb, they might not offer much at first, but once said bomb is detonated, the explosion is contained to a single square radius, resulting in the temple's destruction, no matter the size of the bomb. Other tiles you'll encounter include teleporters, switches, and spinners. while teleporters and switches are self-explanatory more or less. Spinners will throw you one tile in any direction, which can have dangerous consequences if you're not careful. All of these building blocks really allow for some unique and challenging levels to be constructed. Though, that being said, I feel there's a tough balance in introducing them, and I honestly feel the introductions of each tile type and mechanic could have been spaced out a little more. And that's really just from the level structures of the C64 original. With the increased numbers of levels in the 16-bit versions, this pacing feels even more out of touch, and the game shows its cards early, leaving little to be discovered later on, which can add to that feeling of things being dragged out somewhat. Like any good puzzle game though, there is a password system which can ease the potential tedium. On running out of lives, you'll be given a password for when you next start the game up. New ones are earned for reaching every 8th level in the game, and are thankfully consist of 4-character words, so they're quite easy to remember. If you choose to start a new game without rebooting, the game's continue option lets you start right from the last level you reached. Now this is genius, as it's one of those little design tricks which makes working through those stages where you hit a wall a little more manageable when you want to try again. Something else which is incredibly helpful is the game's map. Hitting space at any time brings up an overview, but there's one thing to stress here. This is not a pause mode, as the timer will continue to count down even while the map's on screen. This isn't an accident, but rather it's a point of design made by the developers, in order to push the game's challenge to be really about thinking on one's feet. And they mention this in the instructions, as they say, allowing you to assess the situation at your leisure would be a no-no. I can't say I disagree off the concept, but looking at some of the stages you'll encounter later on, and let's face it, with some of those larger ones, having a chance to take a breather and plan your approach might work out for the best. But for me, I guess I'm someone who loves it when a plan comes together. One of Bomb Uzal's biggest selling points is in its visuals. While many 8-bit puzzlers tended to offer an overhead or maybe a side-on view, Bomb Uzal gives you a choice in tackling its stages, from either an overhead view or a 3D isometric one. This certainly looks good in screenshots, but when it comes to actual gameplay, the larger sprites and tiles they use mean your view is seriously restricted over the overhead view. So, while you can consider the challenge of needing to quickly plan your route, you can see why the 3D mode is seen as a bit of a disadvantage. And that's really the bulk of what makes Bomb Uzal. So, now it's time to sit down and really take a look at those ports. The original Commodore 64 release, and its conversion to both the Amiga and the Super NES to see how it all stacks up. Before we get underway, it's worth noting that of these 3 versions, I'm going to admit that I spent the most time with the Commodore 64 original. So, coming down to these comparisons, I thought it best to focus on a few particular areas, which is where we're going to start off with, in this case, the presentation. Outside of its opening intro, the Commodore 64 version is surprisingly squeezed into a single load. For what it's worth, the intro doesn't really add much, so you're only going to see it if you're playing an original tape or disc copy, and if you're not, you aren't really missing much. From the main menu, you've got the option to start a new game or continue from where you left off. If you wish to use one of those accumulated passwords, there isn't an easy way on screen to enter it. Instead, you've got to press the old Commodore key to let you type it in. I wouldn't be surprised if this led to many players not bothering to use them, choosing to restart from scratch instead every time they played. There is a similar setup with the interface of the Amiga version, but the option for navigating it with the mouse means the password field is actually visible and far more obvious to use. It does share that distinct menu when starting a game, with moving the stick left or right to pick whether you want to start a new game or continue from your previous game, with up or down, also used to pick the viewing mode you want. And it's no surprise it shares it because it is a first-class conversion after all. Onto the Super NES version, and the change in development team also means a reworking of the menu, which is honestly for the better. Being able to enter your password and start a game and pick the view in sequence just feels so much more natural here. Onto the visuals, and it's no surprise the three platforms all fare similar enough. The user interface here is minimal on the C64 version, and in lacking the descriptive text for each item, it can make things a little trickier to pick up at first. A nice touch included here is a different palette for each level. It's a touch which throws back to many other games of the time on the machine, and whilst back then might not have felt special, coming back to it now, it helps it feel quite distinctive as a result. The split between the 2D overhead and 3D isometric visuals is an important one, especially as unlike the other versions, you can't freely switch between them here. Though the 3D one does look nicer in screenshots, especially thanks to the chunkier pixels of the C64's multicolor modes, I simply can't forgive the lack of clarity which it brings to the mechanics. 2D mode works far better as a result, particularly when distinguishing the size of bombs and mines. It's minor, but I feel it's utterly critical. Hopping to the 16-bit side of the fence, and one of the first things you're going to notice, especially in 3D mode, is your player character. I don't know why exactly, but the character design on both the Amiga and Super NES is just missing something over the C64 original. Once again, 2D mode is the preference for me here, especially on the Super NES, where the console's lower resolution greatly reduces the size of the view, which impacts playability as well, as while the map view on the computer versions kept the timer counting down, on the Super NES, it's paused to help give you that slight advantage, which, let's face it, you're going to need with that reduced view. If you do start a game and think you chose poorly, you can flip modes at a glance, pressing F1 on the Amiga or hitting select on the Super NES controller. Sound makes for another distinctive factor, though with less of a gap between the versions. Both the Commodore 64 and Amiga versions only offer music on the title screen, though not the same composition. It's certainly one which I appreciated more from the C64. One thing I love with the C64 version is the choice to use both sampled and synthesized sound effects in-game. Using samples for the explosions was a great move, as it adds plenty of atmosphere to the game, even with the lower, crunchier sample rates on offer. The Amiga features those effects, but obviously at a higher quality, where they do the job, but it feels kind of sterile compared to what the C64 put out. Maybe it's just because the Amiga entirely relies upon samples instead of that mix as employed on the C64. For the Super NES, along with the title tune, there's also music played in-game. It softens the atmosphere somewhat, especially over the Commodore 64 original. The inclusion of a jingle for finishing a stage truly adds to that more light-hearted atmosphere as a result. All up, it helps this version carve out its own personality, and that's not much of a surprise when you think about it. Now for the big one, playability. You may think that because of the relatively simple mechanics on offer in Bomb Uzal, there wouldn't be much of a difference between the three versions. Truthfully, you would be quite wrong. The first and biggest point of difference is in the controls. With the Amiga version, the joystick controls I found to be overly sensitive. Whether it's accidentally trying to detonate a bomb when you simply want to pick it up and move it down a track, which is something that happened on far too many occasions to be just a coincidence for me. Or perhaps when you're trying to move quickly down a path and find yourself accidentally heading off the end. Regardless, I found the Amiga version to be a serious test of patience here as a result. The C64 version, on the other hand, plays like a breath of fresh air. The controls respond well, but more importantly, aren't overly sensitive. So if you screw up and make a mistake, it's the fault of you and you alone. The Super NES version takes things one step further, as its controls take advantage of the gamepad to offer separate buttons for picking up bombs as well as detonating them. This greatly eases the frustration you may have had the controls not been as tight and responsive as they are on the C64. Something else I found really helped on the Super NES version is the passwords, where both the Commodore 64 and Amiga issued new passwords on every 8th level. For the Super NES version, each stage issues you a password, and you don't need to get the game over to see them, so yes, you can collect the ones for levels you beat on a first go. It's a tiny detail, but when you're needing to take a break after a lengthy session, being able to hop right back to where you got to without having to replay a variable number of levels beforehand is a big benefit to keeping you focused on working your way through. And it means the game is far more compulsive as a result. So it's time to start drawing things to a close. From the time I'd spent playing Bomb Uzal, I can't help but say the Commodore 64 original is the version I'd want to go back to. With its larger play area, the tighter controls, and the game's overall aesthetic, it's the version which I enjoyed playing the most by far. At first glance, though, the Amiga version does look and sound much nicer, when you start playing, the overly sensitive joystick controls really frustrated me to the point where, after a short time, I just wanted to put it down. Puzzle games truly need their precision in controls, and for me, this one just doesn't deliver on it at all. Oddly enough, the Super NES version sits in the middle of them. The restricted viewing area is a turn-off, especially as you don't have that visibility, which you need to plan your gameplay properly. So the map becomes rather important, even if it removes the whole figuring out the level by the seat of your pants thing, which the game was designed around. In general, though, I liked Bomb Uzal, though I don't think it deserves the lofty scores it earned on release, especially that 97% by Zap64. It certainly isn't the disaster many other critics tended to comment about. But I guess it really shows that timing is everything when it comes to a conversion, as many of those negative views were based around US critics on release of the Super NES version. That being said, though, I wish there was better pacing for the introduction of new mechanics and tricks, especially with the feeling as once I'd gotten past level 20-something, I'd effectively seen all the game had to offer. Whether it's in short bursts or perhaps spread out over a longer period of time, that may be less of an issue. But of course, the challenge when you're working to cover stuff on a channel like this and a shorter time frame means that sometimes you just can't let games breathe the way they need to. Now, if you're not against puzzlers, I think Bomb Uzal is certainly worth giving a spin, especially if you do happen to have access to an active Switch Online subscription and can just pick it up and have a play. Otherwise, sitting down and playing it on another machine is always an option, but I'll let you figure that out for yourself. Which leaves me nothing more to say than thank you for watching this episode, and I'll catch you on the next one.